Yep, I can see it perfectly.
Beautiful. I'm assuming you're seeing the data security and Power BI side.
Yes.
Great. I love dual monitors, but wanted to make sure.
Yeah.
All right, everyone. Welcome to the webinar today. My name is Steve Hughes. I'm a principal consultant with Pragmatic Works. I look forward to talking with you about Power BI and data security. I know a number of you, more than half the audience, responded that there are concerns around data security in the cloud in general and Power BI in particular for the purposes of our topic today. So let's just jump right in. You likely are aware a little bit about Pragmatic Works. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. Big thing here is that you can get a hold of me. I'll have the contact information at the end of the slide deck as well. But be aware that Pragmatic Works has a number of offerings that are in the data and BI space that we care about. If you're looking for me online, my online presence is Data on Wheels, and we'll talk a little bit more about that at the end. The case for Power BI. So I'm going to start before, you can read through this because there's some really cool things about Power BI, but I also want to talk about why. Why do I care about Power BI and data security? Well, it turns out I have to answer this question a lot. And why do I have to answer that question a lot? A lot of it has to do with this scenario here. Power BI is an awesome tool for visualization and data mashup and a number of other features. If we look at what sets Power BI apart, there are a lot of competitors in the market. A lot of them have capability. One of the big things I think that changes the scenario is how often Power BI changes, and we'll talk about how that's impacting even data security support. The ability to do real-time dashboards, natural language query, the native integration with Excel, something to do with Microsoft owning both products, custom visualization capabilities, integration with tools like Power Apps and Flow, and even Quick Insights. So Power BI is a great tool. But then we go back and we talk about why, what is it that's holding people up? Why are they not latching on to Power BI? I see a number of customers who actually will use Power BI desktop, and they're like, oh, this is so awesome. I'm looking so forward to it being able to be a part of reporting services, and I can do this on-prem, so I don't have to worry about cloud security. The interesting part for me is that that's not what this session is about. If you're going to bring it back in-house, we can go through a security audit of your environment and talk about the similar holes. What I want to really talk about is how the Power BI service and the security mechanisms that Microsoft has put in place to protect us and to protect our data and why we should care. A lot of the things we'll talk about apply in some scenarios to a lot of things that Microsoft has in the cloud. We're going to specifically discuss, answers to questions like, can I trust the cloud? Well, in some cases, I can't help you with that. I can give you the information. There's a lot of information out there from Microsoft about trusting Azure and trusting the cloud, what that means. The CISO, there's a great post out on Azure, or I'm not sure if it's Azure, on Microsoft.com from that team that talks about, what's it going to take to trust the cloud. And some of it's going to be where your comfort levels are. And we'll talk about compliance and things like that, but it's really about you as a customer and you as a business. You are going to make the decision whether you choose to trust the cloud or not. And it's less about technology, and it's more about the teams in place and who doesn't trust and why. So some of the other things are who owns my data. If I land my data in the cloud, who owns it? If you have not looked at some of the statements Microsoft has made, you'll find out who you own it. What about hybrid scenarios? We talk about direct query and things like that. We will show you what kind of exposure that brings to your data center. And then just publishing data to the cloud. Who do I trust in my organization to publish data? How can I prevent them from doing some things? What can I do in order to use Power BI effectively? I'm going to step back again and make sure you understand the focus of this webinar is talking specifically about the Power BI service. So when you push and use powerbi.com and choose to share that within your organization, that is the focus of the security conversation today. We have to start here. I do a lot of work in financial and healthcare and utilities. So there's like 3 major industries with a high level of regulations around them. What I would argue is that from a cloud compliance scenario, Microsoft is leading the way. One couple of things that really stand out for me, these are the specific these are 5 of the specific compliance areas for Power BI already. It is HIPAA high-tech compliant, which means you can get a BA with Microsoft and you can immediately start using Power BI. You also, you can see that's a part of EU and even government UK, and there's a number of other compliance scenarios that apply to Power BI. Not all compliance scenarios apply to the various tools within the Azure stack. You really should look at the Microsoft Trust Center. If you have concerns about how your data is handled and managed by Microsoft, that is the starting place. And then as you get into specifics and want to talk about how they audit and get all the details, they're more than happy to help you with that. Their goal is to bring a high level of confidence that the data that you're bringing to bear on the platform is compliant. One other housekeeping item before I move on. You feel free to ask questions in the chat. If I can't get to them during the session, we will actually work through them at the end of the session. I'll have some time for questions as well. And then anything I don't get to during the session, I will actually follow up with on a blog post. Just want to make sure I covered that before I moved on. So Power BI is compliant. And this is a big deal because, without compliance in place, a lot of customers just can't touch it. So the fact that it is a part of the Microsoft Cloud and is compliant and follows a lot of those guidelines, and Microsoft works hard to keep those up, is really important. But that's just compliance. That's the opening salvo to data security. Am I allowed to, or can I bring it into compliance with my what can I reduce risk? Those type of things that we have to handle are handled in compliance. The next thing of importance is what happens with my data. So give you a little bit of organization around this session. We're going to talk about the big picture things like data encryption and those kind of things. Then we're going to dig into some very focused details around Power BI. But one of the first concerns is, well, who can look at my data, and who holds the keys and the encryption and those scenarios. So I want to talk through the 3 scenarios in Power BI, which are listed on the screen here, around what happens to my data. The big one is data at rest. The first thing you need to be aware of, first thing you should be aware of everything that they're doing. The data is encrypted. Microsoft encrypts all your data all the time in transit at rest. Depending on what you're doing will determine whether or not you're actually storing data in on Azure essentially, or if you're just passing data through. So let's look at data at rest. If you're running a live connection, this means that you're connecting to analysis services, either tabular models or multidimensional models directly from Power BI. You deploy your desktop out to the Power BI service. The only thing, there is nothing actually stored except for the name of the database, the SSAS database, as metadata, and that name is encrypted as well. That's it. So when you look at how can I be compliant and be in Power BI, and what's my concern about landing data in the cloud, it becomes really a web browser and a pass-through for all practical purposes. You are not landing data in any shape that stays there at any time. There is essentially no data at rest in a live connection scenario. This presents itself in a couple of interesting ways. One of the ways you can look at is you can actually do a live connection to a tabular model, which is doing a direct query into a relational model, allowing you to put a semantic layer, for instance, in place that gives you access to Power BI and deployment under those security settings with no actual data being landed in the cloud. So now you look and say, okay, what does that mean for us? It really comes down to your comfort level of using the service, not so much about your data. Direct query actually stores the metadata. So if I was to do a direct query to SQL Server, Oracle, Teradata, any of the number of direct query connections I have available to me from Microsoft or from Power BI, I'm going to encrypt only the metadata in blob storage. This is an efficiency thing. So I'm going to store the structure and any of the calculated measures that were created, name changes to the schema, any of those items will be encrypted in blob storage. That allows the Power BI service to perform much better because that stuff's already there. The data is queried on demand, so you basically request a query, the data goes out, pulls the data back, adds it to your visualizations, and presents it to your end users. So now that's how direct query is handled. Then we start getting into interesting things. Pushed or stream data. So this is data where The Power BI still doesn't store the data, but it's actually you're pushing the data out to them. So the metadata is encrypted in blob storage, but it's going to actually have to hold the data for a period of time while it's streamed. So if you're looking at a streaming scenario, it's going to store it in blob storage or SQL database. This has to do with the version that you use. I'm not going to dig into details on which version you use. The key here is that depending on which version you choose to use, you're either going to be on Azure Blob Storage encrypted or Azure SQL Database encrypted. In both cases, your data still is encrypted. Finally, we get to the most common use, which I find really funny because you think about it as we let users go into Power BI desktop and then they deploy. Typically, they load the data into the model. And then when they deploy the model, the data actually gets stored out in Azure. So in this case, it lands on Azure Blob Storage, both for metadata and data. Whether the data is refreshable or non-refreshable is not relevant to the conversation. The fact of the matter is, with the exception of Live Connection and Direct Query, we'll not consider push at the moment, those two allow no data to be stored, whereas you do a mashup scenario where you're using multiple data sources, those type of scenarios, that data will be stored on Azure encrypted. You need to be aware of that because you can actually look at what you can do to stop that from happening, but it's really hard right now. That's part of the problem. We'll talk about that more when we talk about user capabilities. So just be aware that's the only instance where you're actually storing the data besides, other than push or stream, but that's a completely different use case. The three most common use cases I see are Live Connection, Direct Query, and loaded into the model. And only loaded into the model is actually blob storage. Data in transit. All data is encrypted using HTTPS. You can actually specify the gateway to enforce an additional level of HTTPS. There's a performance impact to that. We'll talk about that a little bit more on the gateway conversation. Data in use is where we get into some gray areas. Data is cached for all connections, including the direct query. And you need to be aware that there is a small caching that is enabled within the environment in order to improve performance. The cache is transient, and the goal is to improve performance for the users. That, to my knowledge at this point, there's no way to not have that be true. And because of the reasons behind that, you have to decide whether or not it's, if that's a roadblock for you or not, if there's some minor caching out there. Digging into that, there's not a whole lot of information right now about how much is cached or what it looks like. It's very transient in nature, but there is some caching involved. It is encrypted and stored in an Azure SQL database and just for the purposes of performance improvement. If that's a concern, then there's not a whole lot I can help you out on that one at this point. You need to be aware of that because as you start listing out security concerns, you're valid to list this out, and it does affect live and direct query. So anything to improve performance, this is what this is about. So that's the encryption story and where data lives in Azure. I'm sorry, in Azure for Power BI. So if we move to the next thing, well, obviously getting your data is really, really important. What we want to make sure we're doing is using the on-premises gateway. What does that mean? Number one question I get from you, well, two questions I always get when I'm talking about the gateway. One, what kind of permissions do I need to give the gateway in order to access everything around, my environment? And two, is there any data stored on the gateway? So let's handle both of those questions. The first thing you need to understand is that the gateway is truly just a gateway. So at this point, it doesn't store any data. There's no plan for it to store data. Its role is merely an access point to consume queries requested from Power BI and initiate those queries on the underlying on-premises data source. So in the case of direct query or live connection, it's doing a lot of connecting to that data. We're not going to talk about performance or what the best practices around about implementing the gateway. Feel free to reach out to me later. We do have there's some ongoing discussions around the best way to do this, but overall understand that a gateway can support multiple data source connections, and the key component of the gateway is its ability to decrypt the connection information coming from the Power BI service. which brings us to one of the more important features to be aware of in the gateway. The gateway itself, or the Power BI, does not request information from the gateway. Even though it appears that it is doing so, it does not do so. I added this image from a lot of Microsoft documentation I've seen. I've added it here because I really want you to understand that the gateway itself is an entry point from the cloud to your on-premise source. However, it does not accept any requests. All requests are outgoing from the gateway. The way this works is Microsoft leverages the Azure Service Bus in order to queue up queries as messages, essentially. The gateway has the ability, it is always pulling that bus and that message queue, essentially, and saying, hey, do I have a query that I need to do something with? Do I have a query I need to do something with? If it does get a query, it passes that query on to the on-premises data source. The key here is that the polling that occurs from the gateway to the Azure Service Bus, not the other way around. So as the data is passing through, the queries get issued and sent back, fully encrypted all the way through to the gateway. The other key component of the gateway is that the connection strings are stored with the gateway online on the service, and we'll look at what these are. The credentials are encrypted and can only be decrypted by the gateway in on-premise scenario. So as it comes through, it says, okay, I'm going to decrypt the credentialing and the connection information and then issue the query. The keys for the encryption, this is very important to understand. As you set up a gateway, you're going to set up encryption keys. The keys for the gateway are owned by you and managed by you. They cannot be, Microsoft cannot expose those. So in order to decrypt the connection information, that's on you. You lose the keys, you're rebuilding gateways is what it means. So make sure you manage your keys as a part of a normal scenario like this and understand that's what's going on. So as we move through this process, you can see that right now, one of the big things and big concerns that we raised at the beginning in a hybrid scenario, does Power BI have access to my on-premise data? The answer is actually no. It adds requests to a service bus. The gateway, which does have access, goes out to the service bus and sees what it's asking for and then proceeds to push that data to Azure. It is not a pull scenario from Azure. So your hybrid scenario is fairly solid here, and you're protected from the service actually requesting data. All right. What does that look like? So we're going to look at it. I know everybody loves looking at slides, so let's look at our first demo here. So this is the gateway setting inside of Power BI. I'm not going to walk through installing your gateway or making that one of those things that's available. You know, that's a different topic. So I just want to walk through a few pieces in settings. One thing to be aware of is when you get and you have access to managing gateways, you will see this option here. In some cases, you may not have permissions to manage gateways, so you won't see it. But so when we get into gateways, the big thing to understand is who are the administrators. They're the ones who can actually work in that gateway setting. As you can see, I'm an administrator here. And then as we go and, you know, you're going to give your gateway a name and you can fill in the rest of this. This stuff is really not required. This occurs when I actually create a gateway on-premise and I connect to that gateway. It establishes the settings here. Something to be aware of is when you get into this case, I have different connections. So you can see here I have an add data source. You can add any number of data sources to your gateway. They don't have to be the same type, so you can support analysis services, SQL Server. In my case, I'm actually supporting access to a folder. All these things can be set up and made access to and make available for the purposes of refresh, live connection, those type of scenarios within your context. The reason I bring you here is I want you to be aware of a couple things. One is that you can see here the credential encrypted. I can't decrypt these credentials here. I can try to re-enter them or whatever, but they're actually, the only way to decrypt them is through the on-premise gateway. So there is some gateway management you can do there if you need to. But you can also limit the users. So one of the things to be aware of as you publish data out and you make gateways available, at each data source you can determine who has access to that data source and who can access the data in that. So that is a one level protection against, you know, preventing unauthorized people from actually leveraging the gateway. So in particular, this has to do with publishing reports around that. So even though someone may have access to that data source, if they don't have access to the gateway, they can publish all day long, but it won't be visible. So that's the basics around the Power BI gateway on service. So we're going to go ahead and go back to the presentation. All right. That was a fairly simple demo. I just want to get you on slides for a bit. Sharing and collaboration. So what we talked about up to this point was what happens to my data. So now we're going to talk about how users interact with your data and what you can do inside of Power BI to really initiate more security around how users interact. Sharing and collaboration are a very important part of Power BI. Keep in mind the history of Power BI was it's initially a individual self-service BI tool. And as Microsoft has grown it over its 18 months of life so far, and so about a year and a half it's been alive, right? So it's not been GA'd for very long. A number of things were added and initiated to help sharing and collaboration. If you think of terms of Power BI, if those of you who might be running a SharePoint BI instance on-premise, Power BI essentially replaces that functionality, and that's the goal. And that if you're running Office 365, you would actually leverage Power BI for most of your BI work. So next we go and we talk about the different ways to handle this. Sharing dashboards. So to begin with, I was not a fan of sharing dashboards. The reason is because pretty much anybody can share with anyone, including outside your organization. We're going to go through some tenant settings that you're going to want to set, but this is one of the ones you're going to want to change. If you are running Power BI today and are not aware of it, a user can share their Power BI desktop with someone outside your organization. This is on by default. So, recommendation 1, make sure you go turn this off, because I'm pretty sure most of us aren't in the business of sharing outside our organization. If you want to share outside the organization, it's there. But when you share as a read-only copy. The dashboard is fully interactive, and you can get to the reports, but you have no ability to add content or expand on it at all. And you get a little sharing symbol, which you can see in the image I have on the right there. It's actually, that's your share image, and it shows that, hey, this is shared, which means I can't edit it when I work with it, whereas other dashboards I can edit and work with. Why is this great? Well, one of the nice things about sharing, I can actually share with a security group, and I can share with a distribution list. So if I wanted to create a dashboard that I wanted to be read-only and distribute to my sales team, and I have a distribution list, I can share with them. They can't modify or change it at all, but they will be able to interact with it and use it. Typically speaking, those dashboards will show up in the My Workspace portion, which we'll talk about workspaces here next. You can also share into other workspaces, but typically, by default, it usually just goes into the workspace. Workspaces. Okay, workspaces are both great and horrible, all at the same time. You're welcome. Workspaces create an Office 365 group. When we look at the admin settings, I'm going to show you what the difference is here. But it only accepts users. So you notice in the create a group image, it says add group members, enter email addresses. No one wants to do this if your company is over the size of 10. For this reason, workspaces have limited data security functionality for the purpose that we would typically use, because maintenance is hard. Let's be frank about it. If I have to work that hard to maintain it, that could be a problem. Now, what I can do is I can create a group that essentially operates as a folder and allow everybody access. So I can create, you see in the setting, I can create private or public. Let's give everybody access to my workspace. That essentially turns it into a folder on Power BI. Why that matters is I can actually turn that to read-only and deploy content to there that is read-only, and users can interact with it, but they're unable to make changes. So there is some positives to using workspaces. I'm not entirely enamored with how the Office 365 group setting works and the fact that we can't add a security group or distribution list when we add group members. That limits the capability and functionality of workspaces. I'm sure it's on the list to be updated and changed, but be aware that that is the case. Organizational content packs also allow you to share read-only assets, including data sets. Thing is users can make copies of that content, but they can't edit the original. This has some distribution and collaboration features that are nice, but it may or may not meet your needs in a sharing scenario. So these three concepts all are garnered around how do I share and collaborate with content within the organization, evaluating those and understanding the security implications and what read-only is versus editing. Those type of things will be part of your security story when it comes to implementing them in this environment. The next two are about moving data outside the walls. So publish to web. You heard it here. This is on by default. If you have a Power BI implementation today and you have not went to tenant settings, which we will show you later, like I said, you will want to turn this off now. There is no security with this on. Once you publish to web, I don't need credentials. It's as if it's a free to read whatever I have out there. Now, granted, they can't make changes, but it's really a way to publicly expose information. If you have a scenario that you need this, my recommendation is create a different subscription for it. And I say that because you're going to want to actually separate the ability to publish to web out of your organizational dashboards. You do not want any user publishing sensitive internal content to the web. This is a significant hole in security that they provided a way to fill, but it is on by default, and you need to go and fill it as soon as possible. Exporting and printing, those are like the normal exporting and printing rules. You can turn on exporting and you can turn off exporting and turn off printing. Those are two of the most highly requested features within the Power BI tool set. I would recommend you move cautiously and understand what your rules are internally to know whether or not I should be exporting or not, or printing. So you need to make a decision about whether you turn those features on or off within your environment. It's like anything. If you can export the data and they can send an email and there's no way to block them, you have a data security issue, but it's generally around the individuals operating within your company. It's not a function of the tool. So this is, like I said, these two features were two of the most highly requested features in Power BI when we started deploying to enterprise. They're also the biggest risk you take on when you allow them, but it's no different than if you had other tools that allow exporting the CSV. If you already allow it, then it's kind of a moot point. Data can be pushed around your environment outside the context. So a little bit of demos here. Let's have a look. So what I want to do here first is we're going to talk through a Power BI group. In my my credentials here, you can see that I can actually edit a group. You notice here I have Power BI two group members with a member and an admin. Why this is important. An admin is the one who controls what happens in the group. So you can have multiple admins who are able to publish to the group. When I can actually set this up to be members can only view Power BI content. So there is some value here. Like I said, management's a bigger issue. The fact that I can only enter addresses is a problem for me because of how we would typically try to run security through Azure Active Directory or equivalent functionality, making this more difficult for us to actually work within this context. But that being said, it does work. You can create a new group. Let's go ahead and cancel here real quick. I was editing that group, but we can actually go and let's edit. Add a new group workspace. You can see here when you see the settings, public, anyone can see what's inside. If you're trying to create a read-only group, I would highly recommend you use this context. Public, anybody can see what's inside, and members can only view Power BI content. That turns it into a public folder with read-only access to the content within it. So that gives you kind of an idea of how you can actually use work groups or workspaces to actually match. There's just too many terms in there. They're called workspaces, but you create a group and they're group workspaces is what they are essentially. The other thing I wanted to show in this scenario, let's see if it's on this one. Nope, I think that must be, let me find Chrome here. So in this case, we have the read-only workspace. Because I'm sharing, I just want to show some of the sharing features here as well. So in this case, this Van Arsdale dashboard is shared with me. I'm using a different user, that's why I'm in different Chrome browsers. This is that Power BI user you saw. So I have the ability to still interact with the data, drill into the dashboard, couple things you'll notice immediately is I do not have the ability to edit report. I do have the ability to print in my case, and then these are still preview options, which I have turned on, so they're not part of the security feature yet. But I can't really do a whole lot with this because realistically I'm primarily focused on the ability to view the data, but not to modify what's going on here. So at this point, we're protecting ourselves and protecting our users in a share scenario. I like this scenario. I think it actually is a great way if you're doing enterprise dashboarding or executive level dashboarding where you want to present something to executives, but you don't want them to necessarily be able to edit it. You want to make it simple. This is a feature that works very well for that. All right. Read-only support. The number one gap still, in my opinion, in the Power BI scenario is a lack of read-only support. There is no read-only user or subscription. Realistically, there are a lot of us that wish that that was available, or I could take even a Power BI Pro user and make them a read-only user. This matters because there's nothing in the model today to prevent publishing to Power BI online. Without that capability, you run the issue where people can still publish to their workspace, but potentially share outside of their workspace within the organization, and there's no way to prevent that. So when we start talking about data security, which we're talking about, the security of your data, where is it going to land, who has access to it, those are things that you have to take into account when you build out Power BI. There are ways you can handle it. I've worked with some organizations who limit the ability to install Power BI desktop to their users' desktops. Ironically, that is actually a great way to keep users in read-only mode, because if you do that for them, they can't actually publish their own content anymore, and you'll be able to actually share outside the organization or share within the organization using sharing mechanisms, workspaces, and content packs, things that we talked about allow read-only functionality. That does prevent users from actually being able to add content, but you need to be in control of desktops using the variety of controls that Microsoft has around it. So be aware that so this is partly my opinion, but realistically one of the areas that you are going to continue to run into issues around, especially working with your security teams, is that you're going to need pro users. We need pro users because we need to be able to share and use workspaces and content packs without having limitations. So now you're in pro user subscription. Once you give users a pro user subscription and access to Power BI desktop, they can create new content. So be aware of that. If you're interested in digging into that more, we can talk through some of the nuances of that. But that's a real concern in the space, and hoping that that gets rectified soon, that we get a read-only user as a part of what we do. Free users. I wanted to talk about that before. Free users. If you're going to try and secure your environment, don't use free users. You can turn those off within the Office subscription. You can make it so that the free user is not available and they can only use Pro. I highly recommend that. That limits your exposure to the ability of people to publish publish data to Power BI. You should have free users turned off in general. That's just a good practice to have for your organization. Admin portal and tenant settings. I've been talking about it a lot. These matter. Share content with external users. We recommend that this is disabled. Publish to web. Recommend again that this is disabled. I'll show you where those both are here in a second. The export data, export to PowerPoint and printing, evaluate for what you need. Content packs, you can actually disallow publishing for the entire organization, which means that someone can't publish a content pack that everybody can get to. They have to publish that content pack for access by a specific set of users, security group, distribution list, those type of scenarios. And then when you do a get data and you can see the organizational content packs, you only see those packs that you have permissions to see. All right, so I think the next thing is really the demo of this. Let's dig into these settings. In Power BI, here to get to this area, you need to be an admin with Power BI admin permissions on your account. If you do not have those permissions, you will not see this. Depending on where you are with Office 365 implementation will determine whether or not you have access to the admin portal within Power BI. To be clear, Microsoft did something very good for us. They actually have created an admin portal that is for Power BI in admin portal and be able to get into this section. It has a number of other components in here. Our primary concern right now is tenant settings that we're looking at. This top block of export and sharing settings, that is really what we're looking at. So let's go through, I think we'll just go through this entire set so you have an idea what you can set, not set. So share content with external users. Exactly what we talked about. You can share dashboards outside your organization. This does work. I highly recommend you turn it off. In such scenario where you actually are running a business-to-business type operation and you need to be able to share content with users who also have Power BI accounts outside of your organization, you can actually specify security groups, or you can and say who they are that can actually publish this out. Publish to web, disable. These are on by default right now. You want to disable this for your entire organization unless you're actually publishing to web. That's just, I'm not even going to dig into that more. Exporting data, you can actually set this up to say you can export from a tile or visualization. You can say who has permission to do that. So maybe general users, you don't want to have access to that, but if you're an analyst or you're an analyst security group, you'll have access to exporting data. Like I said, this is one of those areas where you need to be very cautious about how you implement, and depending what policies you have in place, it could prevent users from using the tool if you have this functionality in another tool that they can use whenever they want to. Export reports as PowerPoint. This is kind of the same thing as exporting data, and then printing dashboards and reports. So you can actually say you can print them, just so you have those all in front of you. Content packs. This is probably the one I would look at changing. Right now, you're enabled for the entire organization. The reality is you probably only want certain groups publishing content packs that make that data and those visuals available to everyone. So like if you created a corporate standard dashboard with a desktop, you want to make sure all this data, you can actually publish it out for the entire organization. It's up to you how you do that. The other one is templates. I didn't dig into this much, but realistically, this is already disabled. You can decide who can build templates or not build templates. There are other settings within the admin portal that you need to be aware of. So you need to, just kind of browse through these and see if they match what you're doing. Auditing is probably the other thing you want to make sure you have enabled and are paying attention to who's accessing your data. It is essentially going to give you all that information in the audit logs that are here. I don't want to talk about that very much. They are actually over in Office 365 admin. One thing to be aware of is that if you don't have permissions to Admin Center, you will not have access to the audit logs. So just be aware of that. Going to the Office Admin Center. Why do I want to bring you here? Because you need to understand what type of users and things are available to you. So when we get into the Admin Center here, this is my user settings. So you can see product licenses. I actually have a Power BI free license. And the reason I brought this up is this is part of what you want to make sure goes away if you're not willing to open up free licenses to the organization. The interesting part is you have unlimited number of those, but that's a different story for a different day. So you can see here, I actually am Global Administrator. I actually own this account. I go and look at what's in the groups. So when I mentioned before, when you create a group in Power BI, it creates an Office 365 group like this right here. The problem is this group does not allow for inclusion of other security groups, and it doesn't allow a distribution list to be added to it. It is a user-by-user scenario, meaning you will add every user individually. If you create security groups, you will not be able to actually use that security group with the workspaces. That is part of the issue around that, but the security groups work for content packs and sharing. So be aware that those exist, and depending on what you're trying to accomplish, I definitely believe that we should be working towards security groups more often. The problem of adding users is, will remain a problem on Power BI at this point. That gives you kind of a rundown what you can see in the Admin Center and Power BI admin portal about what you want to be setting from that perspective. All right. Data classification. So there are a couple features. One which I'm not going to cover in this session is privacy levels. There's some nuances to that that don't make good conversation. Let's put it that way. Data classification was added to the overall solution. It is labeling. So when you look at what you're talking about data security, the key here is it's not data security. And I want everybody to be aware of that. It does label the content, as you can see here in the image. And if you're paying attention to some of the dashboards I had, it will label, but nothing's enforceable about this. It doesn't prevent the export of data. It doesn't prevent the publication of the web. It has no other functionality other than the label. So just to show you what that looks like, we go into Power BI. This is the dashboard settings. So you can see in mine here, this is under tenant settings, dashboard settings, data classification is enabled for my entire organization. This starts out disabled, just to be clear. If you disable this, you will lose all tagging. So don't just disable it for whatever reason. You're going to basically provide a default classification, like in my case, it's called standard. The shorthand version is up to 4 characters. That's what shows up on the dashboards. And then whether you show the tag or not, you can also apply a URL to it so there's more information. So in this case, I had standard, confidential, high business impact. The reality is all that does is provide information around, hey, this is a Power BI standard dashboard. That's all you know. So if you have policies in place which allow for these labels to be relevant, then you have a mechanism to use them and implement them. If you don't, they really don't provide any additional data security. I just want to bring them up here because they come up in conversation a lot with my customers, and they go, well, does that help? And the answer is, well, you'll know if it shouldn't be published, but we can't prevent it. So it is not really a data security mechanism. It is a compliance, more of a compliance type mechanism. All right. Row level security. So we're going to wrap up on some hard stuff and shift over to questions. Row level security with Power BI works in workspaces with members with read-only permissions. You remember, if you actually don't set up a workspace with read permissions only, they have the ability to modify the document and the dashboard. Well, they have the ability to modify, they have the ability to see all the data. So row level security in Power BI doesn't work unless you're running read-only permissions. It uses DAX expressions, and it's implemented in Power BI desktop. It used to be on the service. It's now moved to the desktop. Row level security also works with live connections, primarily with SQL Server analysis services. Currently, we don't have live connection capability to take advantage of SQL 2016 data engine and its capability to do row level. That's not in this yet. Hopefully that will come, but it's not here today. So right now, only SQL Server analysis services honors the row level security and live connections. For those of you who understand how analysis services have always done this in the past, we are essentially using effective username through the gateway. So we, like on the connection string, we'll pass the effective username. If you are planning to implement this solution, it is very important you go read the documentation on the implementation. The effective username may not be the same effective username you're currently using if you're doing this on premises with SharePoint. So you need to be very careful, look at what it's actually sending along, and use it correctly, and it'll apply security as you would within the normal fashion. The other thing to be aware of is the data source connection will require admin access to analysis services. I call this out so that you don't call me later and say, why didn't you tell me this? This is basically the connection, that data source connection that's stored in Power BI and used in the gateway, has admin permissions to the server and passes the effective username to apply the filtering to only return the data based on the effective username. That is a standard practice within analysis services about the effective username use. So if dig into these things, this is a very great way to actually apply row level security and leave it at the database level so the data coming back out won't have it. Just be aware of the nuances of using row level security with Power BI or live connections. Want to do a real quick demo on this. And this is in the desktop. So in this case here, I have a really ugly dashboard. Don't fault me for that. We're talking about security. So if I go into Manage Roles here, we're on the Modeling tab. Go into Manage Roles. You can see it's based on tables, so I can pick the table that I'm using. In this case, I'm using my table type table, which is joined to restaurants and restaurant seats. And I am creating this wonderful role called Bar Tables Only. I was doing a restaurant, so there you go. That's why it has this type of information. So I want to basically set up a group that's only allowed to see information with bar table types. The filter expression is pretty straightforward. What I really liked is they actually tried to make it pretty easy, so I can add a filter for seat X and give it a value here. So I can go ahead and get rid of that. I can also, if I have this similar filter somewhere else, I can actually copy the table filter from somewhere else if I have a similar type of work to be done. So in this case, the big key here, obviously, has got to result in a Boolean value, true or false, and then we go from there. So I'm looking at this. More importantly, in Power BI, I can view as roles. So I can actually go in here and select Bar Tables Only. And you can see it changed my list over here. Didn't really, it did affect this chart as well. I have this bar up at the top says I am viewing it as Bar Tables Only, so I can test my role before deploying it out to Power BI. This will actually apply in Power BI. Where this is nice is if you deploy this to a read-only scenario, and then you add users to the roles the way you want, and then you are able to manage deal, because now I can actually do a mashup data set and filter what people see based on who they are. So once again, going back in the manage roles, you can see here we have the expressions, and I think then you add people to those roles in Power BI. Wrap up. I just about talked myself out of the entire hour here. Where we are today. Power BI manages data security really well. I mean, at the end of the day, it does a good job of what it's supposed to do. It's continually improving. So tenant settings were just released at the beginning of this year. I expect more releases around data security. The key thing is most roadblocks to accepting Power BI are internal politics, not real issues with Power BI. That was not true 12 months ago, but it is true and become more true today. These are things where understanding how these work, probably the biggest hole still is there's no read-only license or read-only user that we can create that only has read-only permissions and cannot publish. That's probably the biggest hole in the whole thing right now. Overall, there are ways to manage that and handle that within your organization depending on how you're set up. But the reality is, it is a lot about internal politics, and most of the conversations I have to deal with in this area, I'm typically starting to have conversations with lawyers, compliance groups, walking them through all the scenarios, and then proceeding to hand them off essentially to a lot of the Microsoft teams at the Trust Center to actually go and say, all right, dig into the auditing, make sure it complies. And some of those processes take a substantial amount of time. Resources. I am releasing a 5-day blog post that is going out to my website, dataonwheels.com, and I will have, dig into some of these issues a little bit more, and we'll continue to expand on it. If you run across something, have a question or comment related to any of those posts, feel free to post it in there and I will follow up. You should also be aware of the Trust Center. There's a link for that. Power BI security. There's a link for that as well. And of course, if you have not really played with Power BI that much, we have a lot of opportunities for training around Power BI that you should be aware of. And with that, I think we have about between 5 and 10 minutes here for any questions. So I'm not sure, Erica, if there's any questions that have been posted. But
yeah, there have been a lot of questions. All right, so I'll go ahead and ask you some. Kristen asks, how can Power BI embedded help solve the gaps and challenges with read-only users you mentioned?
That's a good question. I actually don't know the answer to it. I believe embedded still requires pro users to actually access that data. So at the end of the day, I'll have to check on that one. I don't know the answer to that one, so let me dig into embedded. I'll work on embedded. I'm sorry, I don't have a direct answer right now. I will find out where embedded fits on the security.
All right.
Next question.
Here's another one. Brian asks, when using RLS in Power BI for the roles, besides adding users via email address, Can we use security group or Active Directory groups or email distribution lists?
Yes, I think you can in the roles for that. I didn't actually look at that demo. I will get that written up, but yes, I believe you can add security groups for that. So the only limitation was on workspaces, and that's RLS is outside of workspace context. So.
Okay. Tom asks, does audit include what new data sources or content has been published?
Well, we didn't dig into audit very much,
Right.
but it does involve all activities, so everything that gets published does show up there. I'll write up something on that so you guys can see what that looks like. Well, you guys keep asking all the hard questions. Either I did something right here. Or...
what events are included in the audit log, and who is accessing a report? Who is accessing a particular data source?
All right, see, now I'm just going to have to switch over here and find a lot of questions about auditing, so let's have a quick look at what it's showing. Let's go from here. This is the advantage of me having my own center, so all right. This is the thing, it's auditing everything around all the events within Office 365. So as you go down, you actually can see the audit events for Power BI. So I'm just going to highlight this section here. View, deleted, exported, printed, exported, added, members, started the trial, create, there you go, create dashboards, create content packs, publish report to web. That gives you kind of the list that's there. So hopefully that helps answer that question. I can follow up if there's some specific thing you're looking for. But it looks like it covers pretty much all the activity in Power BI.
Okay, let me move on to another question. Let's see here. If you want to take advantage of mobile BI, I'm assuming you have no choice but to publish your reports to the web in order for users to access it via the Power BI app on a mobile device?
That's correct.
Okay. Can you share a dashboard to outside organizations when using a live connection if they don't have domain accounts on the gateway?
If you can use I believe the answer is yes to that, because you can actually pass through an effective username that would work, but I'm not sure. So you want a live connection to a customer outside the walls. Typically in the SSAS world, you couldn't do that before. Mm-hmm. But if you share it, you have permissions to, I'll have to double check that one.
Okay.
I'll try that one.
Another one, as a Power BI admin, can I see the number of reports created by all Power BI users?
Yeah, you'd actually use the audit log for that. So what I would encourage anybody who's doing this and trying to manage all this is take the audit log information, use it as a data source for a Power BI dashboard so you can audit your stuff internally easily.
Mm-hmm. Here's another one from Cordell. So if you want to share Power BI reports with users within your organization, similar to Report Manager, what's the best option or way to do that?
That's a good question. It depends on what you mean by share, like in that manager. So the ways that we talked about sharing before were using the, you can use Workspace to basically create a folder that you allow permissions to, or you can straight up share the content and they'd actually see that in their own workspace or a shared workspace in that scenario. Those are the two most likely scenarios that match that. If you have some more specifics around that, just send that in so I can, walk through what the true equivalent scenario would be. But those are really your best options around sharing today. And as far as matching directly with reporting services, I would say that it depends if you're sharing to individuals or groups. Sharing, the actual sharing mechanism might be the best one to still use.
Okay, a couple more questions here. I know we have a lot. Again, just letting everyone know that I'll be sending these questions to Steve after the webinar so he can answer them in follow-up webinars and such. Here's one from Joseph. Can hackers add tasks to Azure Bus to let Gateway pull unauthorized data?
I'm not aware of any hacker actually getting to the Azure Service Bus. So at that point, we fall under Azure Security, which is pretty tight. So if you have an internal hacker, maybe, but I'm not aware of anybody hacking the Azure Service Bus at this point.
Okay, and let's finish up with one more question since we're getting close to noon here. Let's see. Dave asks, any recommendations on where to install the gateway, dedicated server versus shared with other services?
So that's we're working on best practices around that as an organization. A number of our Power BI experts are looking at that. Currently, my best practice recommendation is that you have a dedicated server or dedicated VM for the gateway. And that way, because the performance hit that you take is the data passing through. So the ability to tune that service independent of the anything else is a good idea, especially if you have a multi-use gateway where you're actually using Power Apps and other tools with it. Because that data gateway is not just a Power BI gateway. It can be used for other services within Azure. That being said, there's still a few gaps, like there's no high availability available in the gateway. That's something that they have committed to bringing out and have coming. And they always tell you to put it as close to the data source as possible, which I don't agree with, because that means that you can only do as good as one data source. So I think that's, there's some tuning and some best practices. That's one of those areas where I'm working with a team here at Pragmatic Works to get you some better information around that.
All right, well, thank you so much, Steve. It is noon, so we're going to wrap up. Thank you, everyone, today for joining us. Feel free to check out our upcoming webinars. We offer them every Tuesday. You can check out our upcoming ones on the Pragmatic Works website under free training. Tomorrow, we will be sending a follow-up email with a full recording of today's session. I know a couple of you asked about that throughout the webinar. Additionally, Steve will be following up with a blog post on the Pragmatic Works website answering the questions that we were not able to address today. All right, so thank you again for joining us, and I hope you all have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.